Okay, I believe it is time to begin, so grab your handout and let's open with the word of prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, once again we enter your special presence with joy, with thanksgiving. We thank you for this day when we can especially gather together so that individually and corporately we can exalt yourself. We thank you for your godness, for the wonderful way you've met our needs again this past week. On every level, we thank you that you are supreme, you are sovereign, you're Lord of all, and that we can trust you to provide for us exactly what is needed. We thank you you've given us your word so that we can know of a surety what your mind is like. Now our desire is, with the help of the Holy Spirit, to interpret it aright so that we really do understand you, and as a result, we'll be able to grow into Christ-likeness. Pray for our KBC family that you will continue to minister to each of them and meet their needs, whatever that particular need is at the moment. We thank you that you are the God of all encouragement and you know exactly what the proper response to each situation is. But bless us now in this time, we ask for Jesus' sake. Amen. Okay, if you remember, our topic that we're on for a mini-series here is called The Christian Life of an Old Testament Believer, or the spiritual life of an Old Testament saint, if you will. And as we continue today, we want to talk about the major category or aspect of what we can call ceremonial obedience. Now, on a recent handout concerning the law, if you remember, we said that oftentimes the law is given a threefold designation. In other words, there's the moral law, those laws by which the Creator governs the moral conduct of all creatures for all times. So we talked about that with moral obedience for a couple of weeks. There's also the civil law, Israel's duties as a nation. In other words, some specific things as God dealt with them as a theocracy. And then there is the ceremonial law, which pertains to Israel's worship. And you can see these three at the very top of your handout there. And with the ceremonial laws, generally they're prefiguring Christ and how later on they were fulfilled in Christ. And we have three huge areas of the Old Testament that are often considered, should we say, fairly difficult, especially in the maybe in the application phase when we look at them and we say, well, what in the world, if they simply prefigured Christ, what in the world would they have to say to us today as believers? And these are the three key areas of like the tabernacle and temple, the sacrificial system, and then the festival calendar, their holiday system. And so that's what we want to focus on today. And remember that these three major areas, this so-called ceremonial law, is all about worship. It revolves around the whole idea of worship. So theoretically, as we're talking today, as we're talking about any of these three things, we're actually dealing with Israel's worship. And of course, when we think of worship, we're saying, well, yeah, that is a key component of someone who claimed to be rightly related to God in Old Testament days, just like today. And I hope constantly in your mind you're making transference of how we see the same things today with believers, and there's a few adjustments as we'll talk about them here. But how today, when you think of an integral aspect of a Christian, one thing is worship. If somebody just comes along and says, I love Jesus, but I hate the church, you don't say, oh, great, what a spiritual person who's had great insight. No, you say, that guy's got problems. He probably doesn't even love Jesus. Well, it would have kind of been like in the Old Testament if somebody would have said, I love Yahweh, but I hate the sacrificial system. I love Yahweh, but I don't want to go to the tabernacle. It's like, duh, buddy, don't you get it? Those are integral parts of worship, and it's not a rigmarole you're going through. It actually is a heart response to the God that you say saves you. And so as we talk about these three things today, we're looking at them, of course, in an Old Testament context. But remember, this is the warp and woof, if you will. This is part and parcel of everything that concerns their Christian life, their walk with God. So you see this quote there at the very top then. Worship is at the very heart of the Old Testament. To be in the presence of the Lord in the house of worship represented one of the highest expressions of the blessed life, if not the highest. Okay? So in other words, the Old Testament saint wanted to be in the presence of God. And you can think of, like, as I put there, Psalm 84 and verse 10, where the psalmist says, I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Or in Psalm 27 and verse, well, wait, did I give the completeness of Psalm 84:10? Seems like there was more to it than that. 84:10, no, I'm sorry. A day in thy courts is better than 1,000. In other words, 1,000 days elsewhere. So the psalmist says it is better to be in the presence of God for a day than to be 1,000 days at Disneyland or, you name it, wherever. And then he goes on to say, I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. And Psalm 27:4 is where the psalmist said, one thing have I desired of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. Now naturally, an Old Testament believer could not go and just literally set up his tent or have his camper right there at the tabernacle, all the time, year round. But he says, wow, any opportunity I have to be in this place is fantastic because of what happens to me spiritually in my walk with God. Now, today as 21st century believers, and we think of Israel's worship, I put a couple of good quotes on the sheet, and I'm more convinced than ever that if you can keep this in mind in your reading of the entirety of the Old Testament, it will open up a lot of passages for you, and you won't say, well, that's so boring, has no relevance for me today. Okay? First, the worship of the Old Testament had two basic focal points around which it revolved. There was a form. Do you want to use the word rigmarole? You could, even though that's kind of negative connotation for us, if you will. And there was a meaning. There was a certain ritual through which the worship participants went. At the same time, there was a meaning to the ritual and to the entire worship service, which went far beyond the ritual itself. So both form and meaning were important. It was never a case of either one or the other, but a case of both one and the other. So, as we think of these three key areas today, tabernacle, temple, sacrificial system, festival calendar, we're looking at the form, of course, but remember that form is not an end in itself. It is simply, if you will, a window into important theological truths that God was trying to teach them, that at that stage in history, as they walked with Him, this is how they showed their allegiance. This is how they were, shall we say, growing in their walk. So, first of all, tabernacle and temple. Remember, the tabernacle wasn't built until when? Phil, come on, where is your class that studied Old Testament chronology? Talk to Bob, okay. Exactly, it was 1446 was the Exodus, and they were at Mount Sinai, so 1445 it was set up. Thanks, Bob, good job. You learned a lot in the class. Okay, so remember, prior to this, when you think of a timeline, prior to 1446, Israel had already had a lot of history. Abraham goes all the way back, if he was born in 2166, we're introduced to him, if you will, around 2100. So we're talking about a long time. So it's like, whoa, well, wait a minute. Didn't they worship prior to that? Yes, they did. But basically, the patriarchal setup, if you will, was more they would build an altar at a location where God had done something very special to them. And that was allowed at that time, even though later God would say, you come to the tabernacle or you come to the temple, which then was in Jerusalem. And of course, should we say humanly speaking or practically, that made sense. Because even though Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were in the promised land, God knew that they were going to be taken out of that land for 430 years to Egypt. So, I mean, how smart would it have been, shall we say, as we just look at it in human terms, for God to tell Abraham, now you build a massive temple in Jerusalem, and then in a couple hundred years, all your people are going to be living in Egypt, and you just have somebody who takes care of the rental back there in Jerusalem. No, that wouldn't have made any sense. So God in His infinite wisdom had a way whereby they were worshiping Him all those years acceptably. But then finally we come to the tabernacle in 1445 BC. So on your sheet, you can see I gave you a timeline to kind of trace this concept, if you will, just through this time. And of course it could be traced even farther then into what's the meaning in the New Testament and Ezekiel's temple in the future, etc. But as you see, we have the tent in Exodus 33, 7 to 11, and even though maybe, especially if you read like the King James, you don't realize that this was actually a provisional tent that was used prior to the tabernacle, where actually, before they set up the tabernacle, there actually was a special tent where Moses would go, God would reveal Himself to him, and so on. Then we have the tabernacle, which was the portable structure built in the wilderness when they were at Mount Sinai. That was 1445 BC, and you can see Exodus 25 to 31 and 35 to 40 are the key passages. Then we have Solomon's temple, when finally we get a permanent structure. Okay, Phil, is there anybody else in your class I can call on here for a date? When? 966. All right, way to go, Bob. 966 is when the when the temple was begun. How do you know it was begun then, Bob?
Because of the going back to 40 years Judges, and you go through Samuel, David, and Solomon. And 6 years after Solomon becomes king is when it starts?
I'm asking you. You're asking me if it's 6 years?
No. That's the date I remember based on
Okay. It's pretty close. A few cobwebs since your last class was last week, but
that was further back.
Oh, I was further back even. Okay. Yeah, the text tells us Solomon began to build in his 4th year, and we know he reigned from 970. Bob was giving us a little bit of chronological data there to help us, but we know 970 he started, so 966. And what does 1 Kings 6:1 tell us? It was the 480th year after the Exodus. And so 966, you add 400 years, and that gives us our 1446 BC date for the Exodus. And of course, we don't have much information on the structure, believe it or not, for all of its luxury, if you will, or for all of its greatness. We really aren't given very much information, and that's why when you see maps or when you have drawings in your Bible and you say, wait a minute, this study Bible differs from that study Bible, which differs from a third study Bible I have, it's just because information is pretty limited. It depends how you're going to interpret certain things. Okay, but we do know it was twice the size of the tabernacle. Okay? And then we have Zerubbabel's temple, and this goes all the way down to when you think of the first group of returnees, because it was the Babylonians, remember, who had destroyed the Jerusalem temple when they came through in 586. So Zerubbabel's temple was when the returnees came back from Babylonian captivity, and we're told that they started to build in the, Darius started reigning in 522, and it tells us that they finished in his 6th year, so it was 516. So that's the date you see on your sheet there. Again, we don't know much about this temple, but we do know that it was basically the size of Solomon's temple. The Ark of the Covenant had already perished, so we don't know where that was unless it's in one of your attics and you haven't found it yet or something. But so it was simply rebuilt, but it wasn't quite exactly as it had been before. And then, of course, that was the temple that was plundered and desecrated by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168, 167, and then it was Judas Maccabeus who cleansed that in 165, 164. And then I also just included on your sheet synagogues on the timeline, which developed during intertestamental Judaism. So the point here, and this is far beyond the scope of our study now, but the point that we see is from the moment God created Adam and Eve in Eden, all the way till Revelation 21 and 22, what's the most blessed thing? Probably we would say that Revelation 21 and 22 tell us in a simple statement. Reestablishment of the temple. Anybody else? God Himself is in our midst, and we will be with Him. I mean, that summarizes eternity. I'm going to be with God. Well, what are you going to be doing, Royce? Who knows, but who cares? If I'm in the presence of God, fellowshipping with Him, that's what God wanted from the very beginning when He created humanity. So we come full circle as God made preparations after Adam and Eve blew it. He didn't just say, forget humanity, I'll just dwell alone in eternity by myself and have a good time. I don't need other things to make me happy. He said, no, I created human beings to be with me. And ultimately, that's the blessing of heaven. Okay? So, very, very quick overview here when we think of some of the theological points to note concerning the tabernacle and then the temple. First of all, remember that the blueprint was God-given. In Exodus 25 and verse 9, God told Moses, according to all that I show thee after the pattern or blueprint of the tabernacle, and the blueprint of all the instruments thereof, even so shall you make it. Chapter 25, verse 40. And look that thou make them after the pattern which was showed you in the mountain. Likewise, he says in chapter 26 and verse 30, you shall rear up the tabernacle according to the fashion thereof which was showed you in the mount. And there's some other references too that you can see there. But the point is, this is extremely significant because God was simply telling them, okay, access to me is on my terms, not on your terms. In other words, God didn't say, okay, man blew it, but I want you to have access to me, so just lick your finger, stick it up to the wind, see which way the cultural breezes are blowing today, and then you devise a really neat way whereby you can enter my presence. No way in the world. God said, you sinned against me. I'm a holy God. You're a sinful people. I want you to dwell with me, but I'm going to set the standard. I'm going to tell you this is how you do it. There's no such thing, shall we say, as freelancing when it comes to how do we approach God acceptably. And so God told them this is how you're going to do it. Really neat thing, and again, this is for a whole nother, we don't get too many rainy days around here, so it's got to be for a day that's maybe not rainy, but you still have time to think. But space communicates. I mean, stop and think how space communicates. Think of an architect, and you study the master architects of the last 100 to 200 years. Virtually every one of them has his own special stamp he put on every house or every building he built. Whether it's a majority of glass, whether it always faces the east with a lot of glass, whether it has a certain roof line to it. I mean, it's amazing. You think of interior designers, and they don't just say, oh, you're hiring me, paying me big bucks to do some interior work on your house. Let's just slap some carpet on the floor and let's just, I've got some old paint in my garage from, I think, about 2010. We'll just put that on the wall and hope it sticks. And no. They say, well, what do you want to express so that when somebody enters your house? Well, we want it to look spacious, or we want lighter colors, or whatever. Space communicates. Think of even retail stores. Surely you know this. You're not so duped that you think that's all haphazard. When you walk in a retail store, they have it down to a science. Exactly what they're going to place where. Why do they always put milk at the back of the store? They don't want you to run in and get a gallon of milk and walk out. And I mean, our expert from Smith's Kroger's here is shaking her head in agreement. Yeah, they put it in places where you've got to see everything else and you say, oh yeah, I didn't know I needed a bag of chips, but probably I do. Oh, yeah, you say ice cream bars, the grandkids are coming over. I didn't know I needed it, but I probably do. Everything is laid out immaculately because they know space communicates. It tells you something about the place. And that's the way it was with God's tabernacle. He said, I'm going to give you a blueprint that will communicate incredible theological truth to you. So very quickly, you see on your sheet there just a few of the names. And these were names that were especially highlighted for the tabernacle, and although they were often used for the temple then, the temple had some other names. One of them, in Exodus 25 and verse 8, was the sanctuary, where God said, and let them make me a sanctuary. This is the Hebrew word for a holy place. So right out of the gate, if you will, God was telling them the tabernacle is going to be a place specially set apart from every other place on the planet, if you will. Because this is the place of my localized presence, and this is where I'm going to be manifesting myself. And therefore we could say it shows things like uniqueness or set apartness or transcendence. Now the really interesting thing, if you keep reading in 25:8, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Wait a minute. God says, in effect, I am unique. I am in a totally different category. I'm up here and you're down here. But God says, you know what? I want it to be a bridge in order that you can enter my presence. And the word the King James translates here as tabernacle is actually the simple Hebrew word for a dwelling. God says, I'm in a class all by myself, but I want to make a way whereby I can live with you on the desert floor. Now all of a sudden we have the opposite of transcendence is immanence. And notice how you spell it. You don't spell it I-M-M-I, it's I-M-M-A. Immanence, meaning he's right here on the desert floor with them. Well, not only that, a third name, as you see, is the tabernacle of the congregation. Again, using King James terminology. Tabernacle is just a standard Hebrew word for tent. Bob had a tent. Tom had a tent. Wilson had a tent. I mean, it was just the place where you lived. A common word for this is my house. This is where I live. And God says, yes. He says, I want you to know that I'm going to just live in a place like you're living. And then the word for congregation is actually a word that has to do with a meeting or assembly. So he says, hey, I'm going to build a tent where we can meet. I mean, wow, these are incredible names or incredible titles God gives to this place as he wants to show them. He wants to fellowship with them. He's not trying to be standoffish. Okay? So, three big concepts to remember, I think, here. Number one is approachable. It's always been God's desire to have people be able to enter his presence. We already said that. Unapproachable, but the opposite end of the spectrum of dwelling in his presence is you need to remember that this is not Joe next door who's living in that tent. This is the God of glory. This is the creator of the universe. This is the sovereign over everything who lives in that tent next door. And therefore you show utmost respect and honor. But then thirdly here is awesome. Okay? While man can draw near to God, he cannot be flippant or casual because this is the dwelling of the glory of God. You've heard the expression Shekinah, which simply goes back to that Hebrew word for dwelling. But this is where the glory of God is revealed, and the glory of God refers to everything about his nature, his attributes, his works, etc. So, I mean, this is incredible. On this desert floor, I'm living in a tent, and here in the very middle of the encampment of all of the children of Israel, God says, hey, I've got a tent too. And I want you to come, and I want you to have fellowship with me. Okay? Now, again, is it starting to make more sense to us of how significant this is in the daily spiritual life of an Israelite believer? Okay? Now, you remember the basic blueprint of the tabernacle, I'm sure. And I didn't put one on your sheet because I ran out of space. Okay? But just, and you can see I didn't draw the original blueprint, or it would have looked a little better, hopefully. Okay? But you entered from the east, okay? And as you entered from the east, so we'll see here in just a second, as you entered from the east, there were various pieces of furniture, if you will, that you would see. And again, because God said, you build these pieces of furniture, it was a matter of, okay, these have great theological value. This is teaching you something. And so as you entered, you would find this brass, I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing was it was about 150 feet long, and we're going on an 18-inch cube, but okay. So if you take the biblical measurements, 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and the curtains here that went around it were 7.5 feet tall. So unless you were an NBA player in those days, you wouldn't have been able to just stand outside and look over the top and look in, okay? And then this was the holy place, and this was the most holy place. Those, of course, were covered. And so even if you were a worshiper standing here, you couldn't just look over the top and see it, okay? But as you entered the courtyard from the east, you would see this bronze altar here, and then you would also see a laver, okay? And then as you entered the second part, the holy place, as you entered there, and as you remember, only the priests could enter into this area right here. As you entered there, you would see the table of showbread on the right. Okay, so there'd be the showbread on the right. You would have the lampstand over here on the left, and then you would have this altar of incense. The altar of incense was right there before you went through the veil into the most holy place. And then in the most holy place, remember, that was the place where only the high priest could go on one day of the year, and probably he entered it 2 or 3 times as part of the rigmarole, okay? But only the high priest could enter there, and as he would enter, of course, you had the Ark of the Covenant that had the 10 Commandments in it and the manna to represent the law, etc. On top of that was the lid or the cover, also known as the mercy seat, and that's where the high priest would sprinkle blood on the day when he would go in. And then what was overshadowing the mercy seat? Cherubim, and that was incredible the way the 2 cherubim were here looking at each other this way, but the wing of this one would go over to here and cover half of it here. The other one standing here, his wing would touch there and his wing would touch there. I mean, wow, you talk about an incredible sight as God, again, was trying to instruct them. And as we said, there's a theological meaning for those. Again, because of the nature of our study, we're not going to have time to go into each of them now. But God was saying, this is how you enter my presence. And as we will see when we get to the sacrifices, they could be assured that if they faithfully did what God told them to do, their sins would be forgiven. They would have access to Him. As we would say, all would be well. And that was exactly what it was all about. And then last but not least, as I put on your sheet for this, remember that while God was building this, He built it so it would be beautiful, but at the same time, it was not just so extravagant that you would say, this is incredible. How could you waste $1 billion building this? But on the other hand, you wouldn't say, man, God is a cheapskate. I mean, He must have gotten that at a all $1 store or something like that. No. Pardon? Garage sale, yeah, less than $1. No, God was saying, this is going to look nice, but it's not going to bankrupt anybody. And so, as I put on your sheet, there was abstract art which represents nothing outside of itself. In other words, especially when you think of some of these curtains and veils and the pieces of furniture itself, it's just beautiful. Then there was also representational art, representing something. natural things or supernatural beings, such as the cherubim. And then there was symbolic art, which symbolizes something to help build the faith of the worshiper. So that when Israel would come, they had some great visual aids. God built in some incredible visual aids to help them grasp exactly what he is doing here. So, you can take a walking tour, and you can see a quote on your sheet that I gave you there concerning the fact that this stuff did have significance, and even though, again, there will be some variation as to sometimes how different writers will say, well, here is the significance of that particular piece of furniture. You know, how would we say it? Don't go head over heels trying to find some super spiritual thing, whatever. Some of the items were just fairly practical as well as having theological meaning. But God was teaching them, this is how you worship me. Okay? That's also simple. We all know that before, right? But we needed a good reminder. Okay, let's move to number 2, the sacrifices or sacrificial system. Now, as we continue in the second aspect, shall we say, of the ceremonial obedience, I put a good quote there to remember. The power of the sacrificial system rested solely in the grace of God. It worked because God made it work. In other words, God said, this is how you will enter into my presence by means of these sacrifices. And you can say, well, I would have done it another way. Well, so what? God said, this is how we're going to do it, and it will work. It will fulfill the proper function because I said it will do it. There is theological teaching here, and that's why I'm having you do it. So, remember, God gave Israel this information concerning the sacrificial system, the detail of it, there at Mount Sinai. And that's why the book of Leviticus specifically goes into such detail. Okay, but it's very evident that the long time before this, Israel was already worshiping God. Especially when you go back like to earlier in Exodus, and it refers to things. They're bringing sacrifices, etc. This had been part and parcel of Israel's worship, all the way back to the patriarchs. So it wasn't like this was just a Johnny-come-lately thing. Now, 3 quick things to remember negatively when we think of sacrifices. And I didn't put these on your sheet due to space. But remember, number 1, God didn't want them to bring sacrifices because he was a hungry God. Okay? Remember that classic passage in Psalm 50 where it's talking about worship, and God says, because it appears that the people said, oh, God is just like the pagan gods, and he wants us to bring all this food because he needs to fill his refrigerator. And God said, come on, get a life. He says, I own, and you've often probably used this expression, he said, I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Do you think if I needed to stock my refrigerator for a backyard barbecue, I would have to come to you and ask you to bring a dish? He says, no. He says, that's not what worship is about. That's not what the sacrificial system is about, that I'm a hungry deity. I already own all this stuff. Number 2, he didn't want to deplete their economic resources. So it wasn't like if you wanted to be a faithful Israelite and live a Christian life, if you will, in the Old Testament, he said, man, I'm not going to have anything to pass along to my children or grandchildren because God is just bankrupting me with all the stuff I need to give to him. No, wasn't that way at all. Wasn't that way at all. And number 3, remember that this rigmarole, this ritual, this form that they went through did not actually remove sins. Okay? It didn't actually remove sin. It removed sins because God says it will remove your sin because you are obeying me and you're learning this process of a holy God and a sinful person. But it's not like the ritual itself. And far too often I think people get confused and think, well, Israel was saved because they brought us the sacrifice and did that. And yeah, basically it appears they were working for it. No, they weren't. No, they weren't. They did what they were supposed to do, and as they obeyed God, God said, it works, because that's the way I set up the system. And of course, God was teaching them important things about himself, important things about themselves, important things about sin, important things about salvation or being right with God, important things about access to God, etc. All that was built into the sacrificial system. A couple of quotes there. First one, sacrifice is the appointed means whereby peaceful coexistence between a holy God and sinful man becomes a possibility. Okay? So God says, you do this, and that will allow us to be in a peaceful relationship. Now, perhaps we need another quote to remind ourselves why unsaved humanity was not in a peaceful relationship with God. So as this writer says, without aught of the turbulent emotion found in us. He's talking about anger or wrath, how generally when we get mad about something, it is, we're having a bad day, coffee wasn't strong enough, toast was burnt, we ran out of milk for our cereal, whatever, so we blow our cool. No. Without aught of the turbulent emotion found in us and which betrays our weakness, the supreme lawgiver from the perfection of his nature is angry at sin, because sin is a violation of his authority and a wrong to his inviolable majesty. So in other words, you have, as the Bible portrays it from top to bottom, we have this holy God up here, and we have this sinful humanity down here, and the question is, our sin has created this barrier between us and God. If God is really God, and He's righteous, perfectly righteous, He cannot look on sin. So how in the world is that barrier going to be broken? Do we just pretend it's not there? Do we explain it away? What are we going to do? Well, God says the solution is going to come from the top down. In other words, He didn't say, y'all have any good ideas of how you could approach me that I could live with? He said, I'm going to tell you how you can approach me, and as long as you follow this ritual, this rigmarole, if you will, all will be well. Because I said that's what I want, and that's why there's efficacy in the system. Okay? And so there are 5 major sacrifices that you see, and again, this is a really simplistic outline on your sheet. 2 major categories, if you will. There were guilt offerings. The sin offering was to make atonement for sin, because somebody has to pay the price for sin. And so God said, okay, I'm going to have animals. And remember, this is all looking forward to the ultimate Lamb, the Lamb of God who will come down the road. But for the time being, it was an animal who would bear that sin. And then there was a trespass offering, or a guilt offering. The emphasis here is basically the satisfaction of the injured party, or what we might call social restitution. In other words, you didn't just say, oh, I sinned against you, sorry. Wait a minute, you're sorry, you just killed 4 of my sheep and 3 of my cows, and that's how I made a living. Sorry. God said, no. Sin has penalties to it. And yes, you can say you're sorry, but there needs to be some restitution for these out and out crimes, if you will, that you've committed. And then there's sweet savor offerings. The burnt offering, God's wrath needed to be placated, because here you have this holy God who is angry at sin. And so the big theological word, especially as it's used then in the New Testament, is propitiation, where God's wrath needed to be turned aside or propitiated so it did not strike on the sinner. Also, the burnt offering dealt with complete dedication and consecration. That's why this is also sometimes termed a Holocaust offering, because everything went up in smoke. The whole shebang, if you will, and that was in contrast to some of these others. Then there's the meal offering. King James Version uses the word meat offering, but remember, this is a non-bloody sacrifice. It was grain or cereal, probably signifying something like the giving back to God of yourself and your substance, and it was always in conjunction with one of these other offerings. You had the peace or fellowship offering, which was basically an optional sacrifice. And this was really neat because the worshiper got to invite his friends to come and celebrate with him. Part of the animal would be sacrificed, but a good part of it was for you to have a party with your friends, to just have, shall we say, great fellowship horizontally. Okay? And then that was broken down into 3 subpoints. There was such a thing as a thank or praise offering, just for unexpected blessing, where you just brought a sacrifice to God. And God said, Royce, why did you bring that today? Well, God, you just so incredibly blessed me this past week in ways I would have never expected, that my heart was just, my heartbeat is up to 108. I just had to come and say, thank you, God, for being such a God to me this week. Or it could have been a votive offering, where I vowed something. Maybe devotion, voluntary praise, or maybe abstinence, a self-imposed limitation or restriction, and now I was coming because God helped me fulfill it. Or it might have just been a free will offering which was spontaneous. And God says, Royce, why did you show up today? Just because I love you, God. Is that okay? Do I need any other reason? God would smile and say, nope, you're getting the show. You're understanding it. You just love me so much, and you recognize what a God I am and how much I've done. Good, sure, I'll accept that offering. And then have a party with your friends to celebrate and tell them all that God has done for you. I mean, wow. It's pretty rich stuff if you haven't already caught on to it. Okay? And then there were some very important truths embedded in the process of doing it. And again, I'm really simplifying some things here, but as you read those early chapters of Leviticus that are so boring, here are some of the boring things you missed when you skipped over it in your reading this year, okay? Number 1, when the worshiper brought the animal, he would kill it, he would have to skin it or gut it, etc., and we might say that he was the one who was doing the messy part while the priest stood there, and all he was doing was collecting the blood so he could throw it against the altar in different places. And maybe you say, well, why in the world, if you brought a sacrifice, did God give you the messy part? We don't really know, but I suspect, or writers suspect, on the one hand, God wanted the worshiper to be not be a bystander in the whole process. In other words, he didn't just want the worshiper to stand there and say, oh, wow, look at that. There's one of my sheep. He's being slaughtered by the priest. How about that? No. God made him, if you will, get down and dirty so that he would realize, indeed, this is for my sin. This is supposed to be teaching me some stuff. And it's gonna make me, shall we say, a little messy. And then we see that it had to be an unblemished animal. God's way of reminding them, you don't bring God the leftovers. Sin is very costly. In other words, it's high-priced. You don't just say, oh, I sinned again so I can bring God an animal that I couldn't sell on the open market because it's diseased. No, sin is costly. Third thing is the pressing hands on the head of the animal. When you brought the animal to sacrifice it, you would literally, as it says, press your hands on its head. And in so doing, you would be signifying that you ought to be dying at that very moment. You ought to be slaughtered for your sin. But God said, I will allow you to transfer your sin to this animal that we're going to kill. And so again, there was great theological teaching there as your sins were being transferred to that animal. Something was going to have to die. Blood was going to have to be shed. I love the next part, a sweet savor. As you read these sacrifices, the text tells us, as God is sitting there in heaven and he sees the smoke from the altar going up, he takes a deep breath. And he smells that and he says, I love the smell of roasting meat. Now, this is what we call an anthropopathism. That's a big word. So you got your money's worth right there in that one word for today, huh? What is an anthropopathism? Well, think first of all, what is an anthropomorphic? Speaking of God in human terms, what is, like in the form of, man. So what is anthropopathism? speaking of God in emotional terms, in the passions, if you will. And so what a lovely picture this is, though, to convey the aspect that as you did what you were supposed to, remember the sacrificial system only worked because God said it worked. As you did what you were supposed to when the smoke went up, here is God sitting in heaven taking deep breaths of that smoke coming up, and he says, I love that smell because this person is doing exactly what I told them to do. And then, of course, you read that over and over in Leviticus, the first 7 chapters, it says, it shall be forgiven them. When the worshiper did what he was supposed to do, God says, sins are forgiven. That's it. I told you to do this. You obeyed it. Sins are forgiven. You are home scot-free. And then the priest portion, with many of these sacrifices, the priest would get a portion. Because remember, he wasn't given an inheritance out there in some of the farmland like other people. So how is he going to be fed? This is one of the ways that it happened. Or we might say today, pay the preacher. Okay? God made sure that as he faithfully served, there was a way whereby he could be paid. Okay? So that is the sacrificial system. Again, we read about it all the time, and yet, if we're not careful, we just think, oh, so what a boring part of the Bible. No, this is so critical to their Christian life on a daily basis, as God was teaching them these super important theological lessons. And then finally, we have the festivals, or Israel's sacred calendar, on page 2. And you can see the key references for this. Probably the most key, if you will, is in Leviticus 23 and 25, which basically both those chapters are solely devoted to these things. And so this is also now a part of ceremonial obedience. And now we come to the times of Israel's worship. Okay? Just as these others were showing us the place of Israel's worship, and the manner to go about Israel's worship of God. Now he's telling them, okay, here are the times for worship. And again, God built into this some super incredibly rich theological teachings, what we would call Israel's sacred calendar, or the festival calendar. But in one sense, yes, think of it kind of like we have holidays on our schedule, on our calendar here in America. But on the other hand, don't think of it like that at all, in the sense that generally in American holidays, what are the first thoughts that come to mind? Yahoo, I don't have to work that day. My employer is required to pay me for a full day's work, and I get to have a backyard barbecue with family and friends, and maybe I get to watch a sporting event, and that's about all it is. Now, granted, generally our holidays are based on important events in our history, but how many of us really take time that day and stop and think about it and say, what lessons should I be learning from this? No, it's just almost, should we say, a frivolous, free day to do what you want to do and have a good time. Well, again, when it came to these festivals, these were divinely appointed times. This wasn't where God told Israel, you know what? It's hard being a farmer, and most of you are farmers. So I'm going to just give you X number of holidays. When would you like them? Which month would you want them to be? How long do you want the holiday to last? No. God said, these are divinely sanctioned days when you will rest and you will meditate and think upon what I'm giving you, because it's such key theology. So on your sheet, as I again put a quote, the great moral principles that lay behind the feasts: gratitude to God, care for the poor, commitment to His providence, joy in His service, all these heart characteristics retain their validity as elements of our permanently required response. In other words, the writer here is simply saying the lessons, theological lessons God was teaching Israel, are still the lessons God needs to teach us today as we walk with Him. Even though the form is different, we don't celebrate the exact days they did, the meaning of what He was trying to teach them is still just as appropriate for us. But the precise forms and times no longer possess relevance. The coming of Christ superseded these typical ordinances, and the divine instruction which Christians are to draw from them concerns not God's will for their own present action. That is, we don't need to celebrate these feasts Israel did, per se, but the truths concerning God, man, and Christ, which the observing of these ordinances was always intended to inculcate upon Israelite minds. Or, as another theologian says, God rules history and directs events that occur in space and time. Thus, the Lord sets aside certain times as holy days and weeks that mark ancient and contemporary history as more than the passing of hours. God calls, provides, forgives, and protects, and the observing of these festivals and their attendant rituals demonstrates Israel's faith in their God. So in other words, he was even by this calendar teaching them life is not just a what would we say, a meaningless, boring thing where, you say, well, I'm born and life is hard and then you die. He's saying, no, there's meaning. There's meaning to all these different phases in life. There's a purpose the way things are the way they are. And this calendar would help them to recognize some of those purposes. Now, Leviticus 23, as I said, is such a key chapter in this regard. The first two verses, which really set the scene, and these are profound, say, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts." Note two key things. Number one, as the chapter goes on, God is going to continually repeat this expression, the feasts of Yahweh, my feasts. And that seems to be super significant because he is reminding them that it is the Lord who established this calendar. It's not just that somebody says, well, I don't want that day off. I want to take a day off a week and a half from now when we can have a family camping trip. God said, no. You keep this day because I appointed this day to remember this particular point. And then, secondly, the expression holy convocation, used 8, 9, 10 times throughout the chapter. Convocation means a call or a summons to gather together for a special time, a sacred day of celebration. And of course, holy is the word set apart from every other day. So God, with that simple expression, was telling them, these feasts that I'm going to delineate in this chapter are a reminder to you that I have imparted a special quality to those days because I'm trying to teach you key theological lessons every single year, and I want you to learn these lessons. So again, it wasn't just a matter of, if I want to keep it, I will. If I don't want to keep it, I won't. Tough luck, God. No. It was a matter of, this is important theology. This is very significant in your Christian life, in your walk with God. Now, a simple way, shall we say, to try and grasp what's going on here, and you see this on your sheet under the timeline. The timeline has the feasts there that God talks about. But as you think of these, basically you say, well, what is the basis for them? I mean, did God just willy-nilly, if you will, pull these out of a hat and say, oh, that'd be a neat day to do something? No. Three bases. Number one, and it can be that with these festivals there's actually more than one applies. And be thinking ahead because you're going to be quizzed on that here in just a second. And I don't want to be disappointed that you haven't been learning anything. Agricultural basis. It was tied in with the season because remember, Israel was an agrarian or an agricultural society. So it's only natural that many of these festivals would go back to agriculture so that they would be reminded that God is the one who makes their land fruitful. God is the one who makes their tomatoes grow, who gives them corn and wheat and everything else. Number two, historical. An event in their history that gave rise to this particular holiday. In other words, it commemorates something. And number three, religious. A theological point is being taught. And of course, in one sense, you could say every one of these is religious because there's a theological point being taught. But you want to kind of keep that category for something special, etc. So our time is almost up. So as we walk through these, the weekly Sabbath, as I put there in summation, basically the weekly Sabbath was simply, we could say that this had a historical precedent. Why did the Sabbath have a historical precedent? Genesis, creation. It also had a religious precedent. What's the religious precedent? Rest. God was setting it apart, and He said that is a day when you're supposed to look back, because remember, that's what God did in Genesis. He looked back on everything He created. So you look back on your past week of labor and thank God for the blessing of it, as well as looking forward to what the next week will have as you commit it to the Lord. Okay? So by the weekly Sabbath, you could put an H and an R for historical and religious. And then we have the Passover. What letters do you think we would put there? What did this celebrate? Historical, H, the most significant event in all of Israel's history, redemption from Egypt. Why could we put an R there as well? Well, looking forward to the cross, yeah, the whole redemptive aspect of it. The fact that there was blood that was shed, there was a substitute, and on the basis of that substitute, they were protected. Unleavened bread would also have the H and R, the H historical at the same time there as the Passover, and perhaps we could include R for religious because leaven is often a sign of corruption, and therefore they had to leave, as they left in a hurry, they were reminded of the fact that they were separate from evil. First fruits, which now comes, as you see on, and by the way, the M and the D, M stands for month, D stands for day. So on the first month, the 16th day is the first fruits. This was the first fruits of barley harvest. So this was the first of the great agrarian harvests, and as such, it was a reminder to them that God was the source of every one of their material blessings. And boy, was this important for them to have driven into their head. Because remember the whole Canaanite religious system. Lord willing, we're going to talk about that more in a couple of weeks when we conclude our thoughts on this topic. But the Canaanite religion was also very, very much nature-based. And if you weren't careful, you could be sucked into worshiping Canaanite deities under the guise of, well, I need to have a good religious crop this year. I need to support my family, so it's okay for me to do this just like the Canaanites do. So that's significant. And then we move to Pentecost, which has a possibly an H you could put there because the rabbis said this actually commemorated the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And if you figure it out, it could be 50 days after the Exodus is when they got to Sinai, etc. But for sure, this is also an A for agriculture, the wheat harvest. So another way God could drive home to them that He's the source of these blessings. Trumpets, as we now move to the 7th month. Remember, maybe the only reason for this one was because the 7th month, remember, Israel operated on 2 calendars. The calendar I gave you here, going from the first month, was the religious calendar. But then they had a civil, or shall we say a secular calendar, and the 7th month of the religious calendar was actually the first month of their secular calendar. And so it could be that this was simply an original reminder. This is New Year's Day, if you will. But it could also have to do with an anthropomorphism, whereas the trumpet would be blown. It would be a reminder of, shall we say, we're getting God's attention. And now that we're starting a new year, if you will, a January 1st, we are reminding God, hey, we're here on the desert floor. We're your people. Don't forget us. Day of Atonement, of course, was the most important day on their calendar, and this definitely had a religious aspect to it, and you know that. The Feast of Tabernacles or Ingathering, historical, because this was commemorating their 40 years in the wilderness when they lived in tents. I mean, this was an incredible teaching opportunity if you had children, because maybe you're like me and you don't like to camp out. And so all of a sudden here, when you get to this one, here your little children look out the tent flap and they see you out there building a little hut to sleep in for a week. And they say, Dad, you won't even take us on a camping trip, and you're building this in the backyard? What's wrong with you? And you say, well, God said I have to do this to No. You would say, son, I'm glad you asked, because I am building a very temporary structure like like we lived in the wilderness. And as it reminds us of the fantastic provision God gave to us in the wilderness in every way. Spiritual protection, physical protection, protection from enemies, gave us food, everything we needed, clothes never wore out, etc. So what a fantastic opportunity for those days to be teaching the next generation how God provides for His people even under the most extreme circumstances. Of course, it also had an A to it, an agricultural reason, because this was the end of the agricultural year. So this would be the equivalent of what American holiday? Thanksgiving. When we have Thanksgiving, we sing these hymns about we've brought in all the goodness from our garden, and we thank God for incredible bounty and how our okra finally grew this year after 12 attempts, and so on. Well, that's what they were doing. They were thanking God for the abundance of the agricultural year. Purim, historical. Remember, this was not originally given to Moses because this was in post-exilic Judaism, but it became a nationalistic holiday because it was a holiday of redemption when they were redeemed or they were protected when Haman had his dastardly plot. The sabbatic year, every seventh year, definitely agrarian because it gave the land an opportunity to rest, etc. You couldn't be out planting crops. It had a religious basis to it, basically humanitarian, as man and animals were able to rest, but also Israelite slaves were released, etc. And then your year of Jubilee was every 50th year. So after 7 sabbatical years, 49 years, the very next year was the 50th year Jubilee, and that was also agricultural and also a religious basis. And basically it included everything of the sabbatic year, plus that you would return all landed property. But I'll tell you, this was a time when God was really trusting you, okay? Because stop and think of it. Here is the 49th year. This was the 7th sabbatical. Here is the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, and here is the 51st year. You can't plant crops here. You can't plant crops here. So this was God's way of ensuring the population never got too many because so many people would die of hunger. Not, okay? Some of you looked at me like you thought I was serious. You say, what? How would they eat? God said, on the 48th year, I will give you everything you need. Do you really believe you can trust me to keep your pantry full until the 51st year? Yeah, God, I trust you. That's what was one of the major lessons he was teaching them. You do what I tell you to do. You trust me, and you'll be surprised at my godness, the way I will take care of you. Wow. This was quite the calendar. This was quite the calendar as God was teaching them how they are to be living a Christian life in fellowship with Him. Okay, our time is gone. Questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions, very briefly here. A lot to chew on, as you can tell. Every one of these topics deserves multiple weeks, but got to keep plowing on. Okay, Lord bless you. And oh, by the way, the great hymns there at the very end of your handout, you can read them as well. I love the way both Wesley and Newton and Cooper express how these great things we're trying to teach, theological lessons, all pointing forward to Jesus. Okay, got about a 27-minute break.